second keynote speaker is James Crabtree, who was Mumbai bureau chief for the Financial Times for over 4 years, and is still contributing editor for the FT. He's currently taking a sabbatical fellowship at the Lee Kuan Yew School for Public Policy in Singapore. So to tell us more about how Brexit is being viewed from India and Asia, and how the Modi government has performed in the last 2 years, let's give a very warm welcome to James Crabtree.
Good morning, everybody. I thought it was interesting that in the aftermath of the Brexit vote, the most, in a sense, media savvy of Prime Minister Modi's advisors took to social media and took to the airwaves to present India as a bastion of stability, one of the few rocks that you could rely on in the global economy at the moment when the Brits and many of the other world nations were struggling to cope with the shocks that were emanating from the UK. And it's worth reflecting, I think, on how far even the ability to say that as an Indian Prime Minister or an Indian minister gives you a sense of how far India has come over the last 4 or 5 years. I moved to India at the end of 2011 to become the Mumbai bureau chief for the FT at a time in which I think people had sort of cottoned on to the fact that the government of Manmohan Singh was turning into a bit of a disaster, but still the notion that India's growth story was at that point deeply problematic, had a couple more years to run until the end of 2013 or about the autumn of 2013, at which point things really hit a low ebb. And since then, under Mr. Modi, since his election in 2015, things have improved dramatically. And I suppose what I wanted to do, rather than what John did, is with sort of placing India within the current frame we're all thinking about with Brexit, is just to put on the table for the start of the conference something that I suspect Mihir will add to the sense of where we think Modi has got to and what remains to be done. And I suppose my answer to that question is a slightly more mixed picture than some might offer, particularly in the business community, about how far and how fast Mr. Modi has been able to get and how far we might imagine he will get, as Lawrence said at the beginning, at the end of his first term and possibly into a second. So let me do 3 things. And the first is to run a quick rule over not Brexit, but Regxit, the departure of Raghuram Rajan from the central bank, which I think is probably the most interesting, the latest sort of talking point in the India growth story. And then run a sort of, what's he done and what he hasn't done and what remains to be achieved as a way of sort of setting the introductory session. I mean, I thought Regxit, in a funny way, encapsulated many of the contradictions of Modi's government. The fact that Rajan, as central bank governor, basically appears to have got fed up with waiting for his political paymasters in New Delhi to give him a second term that is customarily given to the RBI head, despite the fact that international investors of the sort who are represented in this room had an almost universally good opinion of him as central bank governor. But for reasons that are still not entirely clear, Modi and those around him didn't have such a good opinion of him. I think if you've been reading the coverage of why he decided to leave, there's 3 or 4 competing theses as to why he'd managed to annoy people, that he'd strayed too far from his brief, that he'd been too willing to talk on subjects like social toleration that some would interpret as being a criticism of a Hindu nationalist government, that he had fought quite a good fight against the worst exemplars of India's business community in the banks and amongst the tycoons, and that they'd put pressure on Modi to get rid of him. Nonetheless, the result was that the government hadn't been able to make a decision to keep him, or it might be that they had made a decision to get rid of him. But either way, what the reform-minded, investment-minded sort of international and sensible Indian business opinion wanted, which was that this internationally credible figure would stay, didn't happen. And that, in many ways, seems to be almost a sort of metaphor for the 1 step forward, 2 steps back, or 2 steps forward, 1 step back record under Modi, where there's a great expectations for what might be achieved, and the government appears to be broadly moving in the right direction along the sort of vectors that Mr. Redwood talked about, but it's doing so, in some areas but not others, and disappointingly slowly and with a lack of bravery. And what that has meant is that while India's position looks pretty good internationally, it's now the fastest growing international economy, it overtook China amongst the BRICS, which is no longer really a coherent category to talk about the major emerging economies, but nonetheless it's the only one that is still doing well, and that ought to continue. As my colleague Martin Wolf has said, India ought to be the world's fastest growing major economy for the next 2 decades, given where it is in its development cycle relative to China, given its beneficial demographics and all the rest of it. And so I think the Rajan example is almost just a further case of when you run your rule down what's happened in India over the last 2 or 3 years since Modi looked odds on to become Prime Minister and then delivered a far more convincing election victory than most people accepted, which is, as I said, mostly good news, but not as fast or as far or as comprehensive as everyone would have wanted. So if you kind of run your finger down the ledger, you have plenty of good things. The growth rate is high, inflation is low, foreign direct investment is high, the current account deficit has been brought under control. They've really done quite well on the fiscal position, particularly in the last budget, where there was a good deal of pressure from sensible voices within the government to loosen India's fiscal targets, and the government, to their credit, decided not to do that and were rewarded by the bond markets and others, and also sort of, given the brownie points you get for being fiscally responsible. But at the same point, again, India's position looks better than it actually is because of its relative performance against other emerging markets. Modi's political team remains weak. The talent at the top in terms of reformers is pretty scant. There are many of their signature achievements which haven't occurred, whether that's the attempt to introduce a goods and services tax, an attempt to introduce labour market reforms, an attempt to introduce land reforms. Across a whole range of the most important reforms that they've tried to introduce, they haven't made a huge amount of progress. And along the biggest challenges that India faces as it attempts to move from being a poor country to being a lower middle income country and beyond, many of the answers that they're coming up to are very weak. We've heard already about smart cities. I'm a huge critic of their approach to smart cities. I think this is almost all waffle, and the notion that the 100 smart cities comes anywhere close to a coherent program to dealing with India's massive challenge of urbanization is largely ludicrous. It's not bad. It's put the notion that India is urbanizing radically and quickly on the map, but it's a fairly sort of surface gloss on an incredibly serious challenge. The same is true on a number of the other areas I mentioned: labour market reform of land. The encapsulation of this comes in the Make in India drive, where India is making some small steps towards becoming a manufacturing centre, an export-focused manufacturing centre. And Mr. Edward talked about trade. That's another area where India is making very slow progress. The removal of non-tariff barriers to trade, where India on many indices, including the WTO indices, ranks just below Zimbabwe and a few other complete basket case countries. They haven't done very much to reduce these non-tariff barriers. Equally, Mr. Modi shows few signs of wanting to begin to engage constructively in multilateral and plurilateral trading arrangements, and I'd be much more pessimistic than Mr. Redwood would be about the ability of India and the UK to strike a meaningful trade agreement, not because Britain wouldn't want it, but because India finds it very difficult to strike these things because of the political economy that Mr. Modi has to deal with. There is a reason why the EU wasn't able to do this, and it's not really that the EU was hopeless, it's that it's incredibly difficult to get these things through the Indian political system and its parliament. So across the piece, you see that on many of the most important areas, Modi's progress, not for want of trying, but because it's very difficult to produce these sort of big bang political reforms that people in this room and international investors look for. And the third one, I suppose, that I'd point at, where I I've watched this carefully, is attempts by the government to rein in corruption and crony capitalism, which again was part of the underlying mood music around Mr. Rajan's recent departure. The fact that some of India's least savoury tycoons and most incompetent bankers didn't like Rajan and may have been pressuring Modi not to keep him, I think is the least important of the reasons that may have contributed in some way to his departure. But it may be the most important long-term consequence to his going, that he, as an RBI governor, was unusually forthright on the need not just to clean up in the mess in the Indian banking system and to try and disentangle the rather unsavory relationship between the public sector banks and the large industrial conglomerates. And in his absence, that's one voice to try and really lance this boil that isn't going to be there. And it's part of a kind of wider issue where Modi has been quite good at removing the worst of the corruption around the cabinet table in Delhi, and so there haven't been any new major scams of the sort that appeared often in the period before his arrival. But equally, there are huge areas of the Indian state and Indian sort of private sector that haven't really been touched. Many institutions that remain would have just as bad governance as they did on the day that he arrived, and most importantly, the relationship between politics and private capital, the way in which the political system is funded, where huge amounts of money have to go into the electoral system, that hasn't really been touched at all. So, you know, I don't want to come across as either being a starry-eyed optimist for India or unnecessarily critical. The Modi government, I think, is moving forward at a moderate pace, and it has some quite welcome wins at its back internationally, again, relative to its competitors, what with the oil price and a few other areas. But that progress is slower than one would have liked and potentially quite easily reversible, particularly given what looks like a very complicated international environment in the aftermath of something like Brexit. And it also makes a huge difference to India itself, the speed and the character of the reforms to its economy that is now undertaken. So I saw some research from HSBC and the IMF, which charted out what India's growth rate, where India would get to over a decade or two, depending on what its growth rate is. If India can grow at 10%, which most people think is quite unlikely, then it will reach about 5% of the global economy by output in about a decade's time. That's where China was about 10 years ago. If that growth slows to 7%, it takes a decade longer. If it's 5%, it takes a decade longer after that. And so the reason why this matters is that small accelerations in the reform program can have a dramatic impact on the speed at which India is going to catch up to its major competitors and the speed at which it is going to make that leap from still being a relatively poor country to being a lower middle income and then an upper middle income country. And in a sense, that is why the inability of Modi to move faster and more aggressively on more fronts is arguably disappointing, not just for people like us, but for people in India more generally. And I'll leave it at that.